Hello, and welcome to this week's dialogue with Helga Zepp LaRouche. She is the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute. I'm Harley Schlanger, and I'll be your moderator today. It's March 30th, 2023. And if you wish to join our discussion, you can send your questions or comments to questions@schillerinstitute.org or post them in the chat box, and Anastasia will forward them to me. Now, Helga, there's a growing rejection from the so-called global south, which is probably more properly called the global majority, of the so-called rules-based order, with moves to break out of it in a very clear fashion. But now we're seeing inside the transatlantic region growing opposition to this order. As you were among the first to call for a new paradigm, I'd like to start with your assessment of where things stand today as far as the attempt to keep this rules-based order with its foot on the neck of the world.
Yes, it is quite amazing, the difference between the perception of the vast majority of people in the world and that self-image which is being maintained by the establishment of the global north, if you want to call it that way. And I think the best example is the summit, the so-called democracy summit, which is being conducted by President Biden, I think together with South Korea and Holland and Zambia, and in any case, a couple of more countries. And, the agenda which is being promoted there is basically the so-called democracies against the so-called autocracies. And, there is a tremendous pressure being asserted to get everybody in line against Russia anyway, but now especially against China. And, this is then naturally the countries who have not been invited is very interesting. From the European Union and NATO, it's Hungary and Turkey who have not been invited. That is maybe not so smart, because, if that makes an example, maybe other countries, why is Hungary not invited? Because it rejects the imposition of neoliberal or liberal values, because Hungary is a more traditional country, and it does not want to join the chorus against, the extraordinary sanctions against Russia. It is for having a decent relationship with the BRI. So these are, all things which are in the interest of Hungary, and I think it's not very smart by the European Union to exclude Hungary. The same goes for Turkey, because Turkey, what is the crime of Turkey? Well, they have basically, expressed a wish to become a member of the BRICS, to participate in the Belt and Road Initiative. They are a NATO member. Are they trying to push out both Hungary and Turkey? Singapore is not invited. But apart from such smaller aspects, I think the very idea that you have to somehow get the so-called democracies all, sworn in on a certain narrative, while excluding the vast majority of the human species from a dialogue is just plain stupid. It does not lead to the isolation of the majority. Obviously, it leads to the isolation of those who are pushing dividing the world into different camps. So I think this is really a sign of a lessening and becoming worse and worse of understanding what are the main trends in the world. So, the questions naturally asked is, what are these democracies? Are these democracies? Well, one can have a doubt. If you look at the United States, for example, the country is geared towards the interest of the wealthy. That's the talk of the town everywhere, that the United States is not trying to eliminate poverty. They have no program like China. China eliminated the poverty of 850 million people. They got rid entirely of severe poverty. the European Union has absolutely nothing similar. They don't have a policy for poverty eradication. And if you look at the recent banking bailouts, with the Silicon Valley Bank, the First Republic Bank, Credit Suisse, which was saved with $54 billion, that was not enough. Then there was tremendous pressure on the Union Bank of Switzerland to take over Credit Suisse. Now Switzerland has one big bank with an enormous, liabilities, because UBS was not even given time to look into the books of the cat they were buying in the bag, so to speak. So these monies are there. Think about all the billions and hundreds of billions of bailout packages for the banks, which benefits the speculators and not the little small and medium industries, the bakeries, the grocery stores, and the same in the United States. Then if you think about the vast sums of money spent on the military, the United States has now a military budget which is more than $800 billion. How much is being spent to rebuild the rotting and worsening infrastructure, to repair the schools, to improve an education system, which among other features has these mass shootings? Figures were just published that since 1999, 175 people were killed in these mass shootings. Now, is that a sign of democracy and a functioning society? I don't think so. The fact that the suicide rate is increasing, the fact that the life expectancy is decreasing, I think for the third year in a row in the United States, is not a sign that the society is functioning well. So if they want to be the standard of democracy, I don't think it's a very attractive model, which is only geared towards the speculators. So I think, right now, this is not, this present system is not functioning, and the Western elites would do so much better, rather than trying to push everybody in line and trying to spread, hostility against Russia and China, but now especially coming against China. They should better reflect and think what they could do better, and maybe they should take up the offer of China in particular to cooperate. Now, in Africa, despite the fact that Blinken and other politicians were running around pressuring countries not to sing, it's not just the change of the pension age, it is the entire direction of the economy, the future of people. People are concerned that they are ruled by governments who are not taking care of themselves. Now, the new element in France, obviously, is that there is more and more violence in these demonstrations, which I don't have the exact analysis yet what was the reason of it, but obviously this could be a sabotage of trying to infiltrate peaceful demonstrations in order to discredit it. That has been used as a tactic before. In Germany, in France, people had the good sense to not have King Charles visit, because people were, the government was obviously concerned that the demonstrators, the masses in the street, would go really wild against a monarch, who is known for his richness and his fancy life, when people in the streets don't know how to make ends meet. So they disinvited him. Germany, naturally, which is unfortunately in a terrible colonial mindset concerning the ruling circles, they celebrated him with a 3-day visit. And what is Charles doing in Germany for 3 days? He's pushing the green agenda. He's going to all kinds of green experimental farms and bio whatnot. This is the Charles program is what is presently destroying the German economy in the persons of Habeck and Baerbock. So this is like a fist on the eye. I mean, that fits really like This is a German idiom, but I'm using it in English anyhow. So, all I can say is there is a really a not understanding where we are at. On the other side, the countries of the global south are moving in a good direction. I can only repeat what we mentioned already last week. The entire Southwest Asia region is changing since the diplomatic relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran have been resumed with the mediation of China. And, Raisi was in Moscow, in Iran, or no, he was he was in Saudi Arabia, or is invited to Saudi Arabia. The Iranian foreign minister is in Moscow right now. There are negotiations going on right and left between the Shiite and Sunni forces. So this is all on a very good track. And, I think that the West is really called upon either to reflect and say that all these policies for the last 20 years have been mistaken, including, to admit the Iraq war was a deliberate fraud. I mean, we know from Nancy Pelosi herself that the entire American establishment knew in 2003 that there were no weapons of mass destruction, but they did it anyway. Has there been an ICC court mass arrest against Bush, Cheney, Biden, who was also in favor of that war? Obviously not. So I think there are a lot of things which need to be reflected. And, if they are not addressed, I think these governments will all be pushed out of office. You can see right now what a storm of protest it caused that Mitsotakis in Greece is trying to privatize water. Now that is a complete scandal. I mean, water is like air. This is one of the most fundamental things which is the property of everybody. And if you start to make money out of what people, next thing is, for breathing, you have to pay money. I mean, this really infuriates the population. And you have mass demonstrations in Greece as a result, also because of this incredible train crash, which took place a couple of weeks ago, which was the result of privatization. And in France, the water issue becomes a very hot issue as well. I mean, there has to be a reflection that many policies of the liberal model have just failed. And, if a country and if a society is not able to reflect and say, we made a mistake and we corrected, well, if they insist with running through, the wall with their head, the result is normally that these societies don't make it and they, collapse. So, I mean, my appeal really is, we have to start to organize the alternative. The Schiller Institute will conduct an extremely important conference on the 15th and 16th of April, where we will discuss the need for a new international security and development architecture, the need to have an emergency summit to reorganize the failing, bankrupt financial system, and to replace all of this with a system where every nation on the planet can prosper and take its interest taken into account. So you should join this conference, you should make its existence known, you should organize for our solutions, because this is the moment where the determined intervention of people, even individuals, can make a difference. I mean, this is not a normal time. Xi Jinping always talks about that this is a change which only takes place in 100 years. And that, I think, is absolutely right. We are in an epochal change. The countries of the global south do not want to continue with the colonial system anymore. And because they have allies in the country of China in particular, also Russia, also the other BRICS countries are working, and there are now 24 countries who have applied for membership in the BRICS Plus. So there is a lot of positive momentum, and the best the West could do is to join and not try to, contain these developments, but to join them and to cooperate. That is what I wanted to say.
I think the most stunning example of this, at least for the Western establishment, is what's happened in West Asia, which for more than a century has been a geopolitical playground and looting ground for the British and US interests. But now it's described by one US official as we're on the outside looking in. So I think that just makes the point that you've just developed. Now, Helga, we have several questions I'll start with on the banking situation. The first one is from someone who's in finance, and he raised the question, what does it mean to call banks too big to fail? He said, LaRouche called for breaking up the big banks in an orderly fashion, restoring Glass-Steagall, write off or write down uncollectible debt, no bailouts. But isn't calling certain banks too big to fail an indictment of the system?
Yes, obviously, these banks should have never been allowed to become systemic. I mean, if a bank is supposedly too big to fail, it means, what does it mean? None of these banks which are having that title are commercial banks. They are not banks who have invested in industry, in agriculture, in trade. They are normally investment banks who have a portfolio which is largely directed in speculation. And, that is the portion of the banking system which causes the trouble. If you look at the big Western banks, their ratio of derivatives to capital assets, it is mind-boggling. I think the worst case is Goldman Sachs. They have a capital to derivative ratio of 99 to 1, which means, they have a very small capital and a huge outstanding derivative bubble. If you compare that to the Chinese banks, they have 10, 20% of their capital assets in derivatives, which, is maybe excessive from my standpoint, because I don't think you need derivatives at all, but it's manageable. And if there would be trouble, that wouldn't mean that the whole system comes down. In the case of Switzerland, they have now one huge mega bank, and if that would go bankrupt, what would that do to the Swiss economy? It would ruin the lives of all Swiss citizens. So I think that is definitely something which must be broken up and must be changed.
Okay, now we have a question from Peter Muller, who is also asking about the banking system. And he says, while a new financial architecture is obviously an absolute necessity, is there not a danger if such a conference that you're calling for tries to initiate a change without getting agreement from governments, that the banks, the hedge funds, and others will create chaos on the international markets? And he has a quote from Lynn from a paper from 1998 where Lynn said, when that disintegration of the world's present financial system occurs, the US and other governments, if they're sane, will each consider themselves obliged to take certain instant, autonomously sovereign, and drastic emergency actions. But he's saying, how do you organize a conference that will do that without tipping off the bankers, the hedge funds, and others so they move to gobble up whatever money they have and move into food, commodities, and so on?
Well, obviously that danger is very real, but it does not really matter. I mean, the big problem right now is that there is a complete lack of trust. And we are sitting on a powder keg anyway. You have a huge motion towards de-dollarization going on among, basically many countries, not only Russia, China, India, Saudi Arabia, many others. So the dollar is losing its influence as a world reserve currency anyway. That has all kinds of potential consequences. I think the danger you are describing is very real, but and obviously there should be a lot of discussion in the background. But what is most needed is that the people in the world should have the feeling that they can trust the governments again. Maybe it's a good idea to do it over the weekend with a banking holiday, shut down the system as long as it requires to reorganize it, maybe a week or less, whatever. But we will come to that point anyway. It either comes in an orderly fashion, whereby governments take exactly that sovereign action to protect the commercial banks, to protect the real economy, to protect all kinds of social systems, like pensions, trade must be financed, other requirements of daily life must be maintained. But the art in this will be to reorganize the system while people continue to live. An economy is, something which supports the livelihood of people. So, I think that we are at that point. Either it comes to an orderly reorganization, or the danger is that you have the Scylla and Charybdis of either a hyperinflationary blowout or, a chain reaction collapse. And the fact that the, central banks are continuing to increase the interest rate despite these banking problems and actually bankruptcies, that gives you an indication how nervous they are. And, just yesterday, the five major French banks had massive rates, I think altogether involving 150 authority officials. And it had to do with this cum scandal, tax evasion. So the banking system is obviously something which really needs to be completely overhauled. And, governments have to act together in a responsible fashion. And, the only way how you can avoid massive damage to the population is that governments would, show some action in coordination with each other, because, you have a very complex economy. And if people in countries just take unilateral actions without coordination, it could also lead to a absolutely chain reaction collapse. So we are really on a powder keg. And, if you, Peter Müller, have studied this, which makes me very happy, you should join our efforts to get people to implement what Lyndon LaRouche has in his wisdom prescribed many years ago, and which is still the most advanced solution on the table.
And for those of you who appreciate this kind of dialogue, this is what we'll be doing again on April 15th and 16th, the two-day Schiller Institute conference, and you can register for it at schillerinstitute.com. Now, also, we can still take questions. You can comment, send your inquiries to Helga at questions@schillerinstitute.org. Now we have a question from Angela, who's a friend of ours from Italy. She said, given that there are large parts all over the world of populations which oppose the crazy war in Ukraine, isn't there an organized movement capable of coordinating itself internationally so that collective actions can be organized synergistically on a global scale? Where she is, how would you direct her?
Yes, that should be done. And I agree with you that it may be the only way how we can stop this war danger. The difficulty is that, there are many people of goodwill, even many groups who have really the same aim of overcoming the war danger. The problem is that, first of all, the people who are pushing the war, the empire forces, have a long experience of divide and conquer. By trying to get people, I don't talk to this one, I will not work with that one. And this is a very difficult situation, because there are some people one should really not work with because they have openly fascist views. These people do exist, and that makes it very impossible for normal people to work with them. But between so-called right and left, there is a huge spectrum of people who you may disagree with on this point or that point, and when you are threatened with World War III, which would mean the extinction of the entire human species, then you should put these differences aside and say, let's discuss it afterwards when we are safe. Let's try to get first, to get a ceasefire in Ukraine, to get to a diplomatic solution, and let's try to get out of this world war danger, and then we can settle differences we have on social policy, economic policy, other issues. And the difficulty is really to get this kind of international coordination. But I can only encourage you, help us to do exactly that, because, I think that is absolutely needed.
Now, here's a very interesting question from Walter Johnson. He said, when speaking about the United Nations, members of the Schiller Institute or the LaRouche Organization condition their support on the UN, emphasizing that as it should be as it was originally chartered. But he goes on to say, for a prolonged period, the UN seems to be supporting the unipolar order, most recently in its recent action opposing an independent investigative body regarding the destruction of the Nord Stream pipeline. And he asked you to elaborate on this question of the United Nations, which we get from a lot of people, Helga.
Yes, I know, and it is a problem. But there is really no replacement. You need a body where each nation on this planet is represented. There is a lot of discussion. Many people are thinking about a reform of the United Nations, especially the UN Security Council. That is very difficult as well because, in a moment when you are almost at World War III, when you are trying to change structures, the danger that they become worse afterwards is also there. So that, is one reason why one should be very careful in proposing any change. I think the United Nations, the UN Charter is irreplaceable. I think it absolutely has to be defended. I think that, the undue influence in the United Nations is reflexive of the fact that right now, for example, the United States is pressuring all Latin American countries not to work with China. Now, that is reflected, among other things, also in the UN. But that pressure is also independent of the UN working. So, I think that the only way how to conquer that or how to ratify this is, that we have to basically get much more open discussion, that the principles on which, that whole international cooperation has to be based must be much more thorough. I mean, our really only criticism of the United Nations has been since a long time that while it is very good and it grew out of the Peace of Westphalia, it has in it the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. So it is a very valuable structure. But I always thought, and I had discussions with my late husband about that actually quite often, what is lacking and what has been lacking is what I could call a metaphysical base foundation. And that is why I included in the 10 principles I have proposed for the new security and development architecture, I have included 3 principles, the last 3 ones, which attempt to go in this direction of a more profound philosophical grounding. That is, first of all, I said that the idea of the coincidentia oppositorum developed by Nicholas of Cues should be an included feature. The coincidence of opposites, the idea that there is a higher one than the many, is like a pedagogical device to get people to understand that they have to think about the one humanity first before national interest or the interest of groups of nations. And that's very difficult. I mean, I have found that one of the most difficult things when you're telling people how we get out of this crisis is to get people to understand this oneness, this higher interest of the one humanity. A reflection of that is when President Xi Jinping talks about the shared interest of the common future. That is guided by the same general thinking. And naturally, Nicolaus of Cues, you have to really study his works to understand the profundity of this idea. Naturally, he came to that through theological reflections, thinking about that the Creator is obviously of a higher magnitude than all things created. And that requires some deep philosophical reflection, which the time is obviously too short now. The second principle of the last three I mentioned was the idea that, in order to come away from the liberal idea that every opinion is as good as the other, which is what happens in the United Nations, where you have political debates for eternity because everybody has a different opinion, and naturally unity is very difficult to arrive at under these conditions. This is why I suggested that there should be a verifiable principle to come to a conclusion what is truthful and what not. And the obvious area is the application of the lawfulness of the physical universe, because that is transparent, that is knowable. For example, if you study the processes of plasma formation on the sun, that's a physical principle of the physical universe. When you apply that and you control that in the form of fusion technology, hopefully this will become very soon an energy resource which will solve the energy problems of the human species on Earth. So for me, this is a perfect example how principles which exist in the physical universe can be a guidance for how we should behave on Earth. And, for example, one of the scientific contributions of my late husband was that he clearly demonstrated that the human species has to move from lower to higher energy flux densities in the production process for a long, durable survival of the human species. Now, that's why we have to conquer thermonuclear fusion energy. It's a long discussion again. Then the last principle, which in one sense is the most important and most controversial, is, I said, that the new order has to be based on the idea that the nature of man is essentially good and that all evil comes from a lack of development and therefore can be remedied. Now, that is a very important conception, because if you have an image of man which regards man as just another beast, or just the steward of nature, or a parasite of nature, which really damages the environment, and the fewer people, the better. The image of man is guiding a lot of, if not all, of our behavior. And therefore, the idea that if you have an image of man which portrays man as limitless good, limitless perfectible, both in terms of its creative power and also his or her emotional quality and beauty of character, well, then that is the basis of totally different policies as if you think man is just a parasite. That's why this image of man question is really the most important. So I have tried to, steer a discussion which could improve some of the principles of the United Nations, and I have invited people to join that discussion. And hopefully, the more people think about how we get to a better order in international relations and on what principles they should be based, the better.
Helga, we're running out of time. I don't want to keep you too long, but we have a lot of questions. We'll try to get back to people who are sending them. But I have one that I think you can answer fairly quickly, which is from a friend in Hungary, and a similar kind of question from someone from Serbia. How should nations respond when someone like Samantha Power or Victoria Nuland or Vice President Harris come to their country to lecture them on democracy? What's the best way to deal with that?
To tell them to go home and leave them in peace. I know that the Kamala Harris right now is running around in Africa and trying to convince African nations to accept LBTG cultures or whatever. And most of these African nations totally reject that. Why should they accept something which is totally against their tradition? I think that one lesson to be learned from these interventionist wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, the attempt to change regime in Syria, it does not function. Countries who have thousands and thousands of years of history and tradition do not want somebody coming from a nation which is maybe 250 years old and tell them what to do. It just does not function, and people reject that. And I think we should really come to the principle of respect for the other system. It's a question of sovereign decision what a country does. And I think that the entire campaign to impose liberal values, what Fukuyama had called the end of history, is just a complete fraud. And what we are seeing right now is the crushing rejection of this attempt. So when these ladies are running around, you should just tell them, don't bother us, go home.
It's the reprise of the old Yankee Go Home. Okay, well, Helga, I think that's all we have time for today. If people are finding this useful, and I'm sure you are because we're getting lots of questions, keep the questions coming in at questions@schillerinstitute.org, and some of our people will answer them, and we'll get the ones to Helga that you need answered from Helga. So, Helga, thanks for joining us today. And again, I want to remind people of the April 15th and 16th upcoming conference. They can register at the schillerinstitute.com website. So until next week, Helga, see you.
See you.